Anyone wants to follow along? We've got more. Okay. So, V'zeu Mayim Razal. After all we said yesterday, and our review from this morning, this is what the sages meant when they said, Yafa sha'achas b'tshuva ma'asim tovim ba'olam hazeh mikol chayei olam haba. That it's better one moment of tshuva and good deeds in this world than all the life in the world to come. Right? Why? Because we were saying the life in the world to come is essentially a ray of the Shekhinah, right? Which is just a finite aspect of Hashem, albeit it has a positive quality in that it's a ray, because Hashem has limited himself. He's also graspable and understandable and filled with light, and we can sort of contain godliness at that level. We can benefit from it. Whereas when it comes into the lower worlds, it becomes completely incomprehensible. So this, right? But on the other hand, the fact that it's come down into an incomprehensible state means that you've now accessed something which is the incomprehensible level of Hashem, which is higher than the ray. That's why it looks incomprehensible to us. And therefore, we've got our hands on this Mayim Rabim, which is actually the essential level of godliness, which is beyond the ray. And that's why it says it's better to have one moment in this world than all the life in the world to come, because in this world, we have our hands on this animal, right? In its most corrupt and separated form, right? Which means that it's as animalistic as it could be. Therefore, its source is shining into it. We can then gain the power of its source by doing a mitzvah with it, let's say, by containing it, and therefore we can unleash the powers of Tohu specifically here, right? Which is higher than all the life of the world to come. L'zos nikro Mayim Rabim Hanal Mei Noach. That's why we call the floodwaters with like a nice name, right? They're called the waters of Noach, which also means the waters of peace. The fisha naise al yidei naicha derucha. Shenaise mehem tevas Noach, right? Because ultimately they create a nachas ruach. They create something very special. How? By making out of them, right? We're making from them a tevas Noach, right? A Noah's Ark. In other words, you can by having the ark, as we're going to soon see, you can get utility out of these waters. Shubachinas tevos atafila, and the famous vort of the Baal Shem Tov, which is that the word for the ark is teva, and the word teva also means words in Hebrew. It's a very handy little thing there. And so the idea is that Noah's Ark really is like just a metaphor slapped in your face right there. What is it referring to? It's referring to the words of prayer, the words of Torah. That's what it says. Come, you and your whole house, onto the teva. It means really into the words of prayer, right? And it's, in other words, take yourself out of this crazy flood, which is the world all around you, making you crazy, and come into the teva, come into the tevot, come into the words of prayer, right? And that's what we said before. That's like the stage one, is that you just like find solace by having his skafia on the world around you, and you sort of build yourself a little ark out of the words of tefillah inside of this madness of the world. And that's why, look, everything the Alter Rebbe said before is now sort of coming very clear. That's why it says the waters increased mi'od. Remember what we said before about mi'od? That the only place to get to the level of b'chol mi'odecha is when you find yourself in the most pushed away dark world, and you have to go out of your boundaries to get out of here, right? The souls and the angels in the higher worlds, they never get to a state of b'chol mi'odecha because they're basically happy experiencing the rays of Hashem, of the Shekhinah. They didn't get to the bottom of the ray where the separation is in its most extreme state, and therefore darkness ensues. They're still in like an aspect of the ray which is benefiting them, and therefore they don't get crazy disappointed in their lack of godliness. They're more or less experiencing godliness, albeit a ray of godliness, but they don't go to a state of bechol mi'odecha. So that's why it says the waters increased mi'od, because the waters give you the state of mi'od. It's only due to the fact that these waters are there that you can reach a state of bechol mi'odecha. And what does it say? How high did they go? 15 ama milamayla gavru amayim. So it says that the waters, they raised themselves up 15 amma above the highest mountains, right? So ultimately, I guess whoever was alive sought high ground, right? And there was no solace for them there because the waters went to above the highest mountain, 15 amos.
Mount Everest?
Above Mount Everest. right? There's nowhere to run unless you're on this boat. But what do we see from here? That no matter how high you could get, you pointed out sort of the perfect site. People go to Mount Everest to get high, right? That's like a spiritual destination for people. But guess what? Right. As high as you can get on ground, it's dafka the waters, right? Which are flood waters and are trying to kill you, which ultimately raise you 15 amos above the ground. So what do you see? That these flood waters give a person a state of elevation higher than he can get without them. So in other words, this idea of going into a physical world and having like the chaos of Hashem seems like sort of a punishment, that he stuck us into this state of disconnect. It wasn't a punishment at all. Only from those floodwaters can you get to the truly higher state than your soul was at its highest point, so to speak, on dry land, which is the higher world, where there's no chaos.
Do you think you would need oxygen? Because Mount Everest, you need oxygen.
I think Hashem worked it out for them. What is this empowering water, powerful waters? This is the overcoming of your animal soul. Has that ever happened to any of you guys? Right? That it just sort of takes you over. You can't seem to help it. It's just trying to drown you. Al b'chinas nefesh elokis, right? Over and above the godly soul, trying to be a little Yaakov, a little mensch in the world. And how? Because be'eseka parnasa, v'inyanim gashmim, you just get literally inundated, flooded with all kinds of physical problems. Primarily just the fact that you're in a physical body. That's sort of stage one problem. But as we've been saying, this only creates a situation where you can have an advantageous light, right, from the presence of these waters. And it's all these words of the Chumash are now like completely read with the Panemius. They're saying a whole other beautiful plot. And that's what it says, the teva, which is the words of prayer, they float above the water, right? So all these difficulties, right, when you climb into your prayer, you're above them. You're not drowning from them. And dafka, and it says v'tara mateva, and they raise up the teva. Teva being boat, teva meaning words. So you might, and he's going to get to it in a second, that you might think that you're not praying well because you're being distracted and all these things. He says, no, it's the distractions themselves that lift up the words. Your words of prayer are specifically elevated because of the inundation from the Mayim Rabim. It's specifically, right? Because if you weren't like praying with like your life depended on it, trying to crawl into this holy space, because you're running away from the chaos of the world, your prayers wouldn't nearly be as powerful, right? You just kind of be chilling, benefiting from the rays of the Shekhinah. There's nothing bothering you, so you have really nothing to pray for with all your heart and soul. It's only because of the chaos in our lives that we really pray, right? So therefore, the words of prayers are elevated, va'olam lamay lamay l'kanal. They go higher and higher because of this crazy world. V'zeu tau sabali asakim. But this is the mistake of a businessman. Right? You have basically the world's divided into yeshiva students, Torah scholars, and businessmen. And businessmen feel jealousy towards the Torah scholars because they're like, oh, these guys are like sitting in the Noah's Ark all day long, right? They get to sit and learn, and it's like paradise. And in fact, this is also like the general philosophical curveball that the Rebbe sort of threw on our generation. Based on all the previous generations, the greatest quality and value that a person could reach in his life would to be like a consummate Torah scholar. He goes to Kollel, he sits and learns all of his life, and he's like achieved nirvana because he doesn't have to deal with the world. He's like the prize of creation. You have people to this day that their job in life is to sit in Bnei Brak and to sit in Yerushalayim all their lives, their wives, their children, whatever. They'll figure out the parnasa, and they're going to be supported by whoever, this very blessed father-in-law that gets to spend all of his money to have his kids sit in, his adult kid sit and learn Torah all day because he's reached perfection, right? The Rebbe said, a year or two in Kollel and then out to the world, right? He changed the goal of Jewish perfection to become a shliach. Right, the ultimate yid is not like the yid who sits in the tents of Torah all day. That's not the Rebbe shliach. I mean, very, 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 very few people. That's their shlichus, right? But the shlichus is to go out and create communities to run into the Mayim Rabim, right? And why? Because the mistake that the Alter Rebbe here points out a couple hundred years earlier of the businessman, but daitam in their minds, they think they can't daven as well as the people who sit in tents. They're jealous of the kollel lifers. And the Rebbe says here, Adarabba, nafochu, it's the exact opposite. The Purim quote. Shehem Yechol Nispal Yoser. They actually have a greater power. They can daven much, much greater and stronger than those who sit in tents. Ki yisruna or hu mitoch hachoshech dafka. For the reasons that we said, right? You don't get to a state of b'chol miyodecha. You won't find the deepest parts of yourself when you're sitting around benefiting from the rays of the Shekhinah. You need the resistance of the world, and more than that, you need the power invested in the animalistic world, which comes from a higher source, and that's what raises your prayer up way, way higher than a Torah scholar, than someone whose life is to sit in tents. And therefore, the Rebbe literally changed the trajectory of a mature Jew. That's what we should seek now, right? It's really a big change. We think that this is somewhat normal, but if you go to Bnei Brak and you go to Yerushalayim and they say this is not what our ancestors did, like who's this crazy rabbi who changed the whole Judaism? Yeah, because he learned it from the Alter Rebbe. You want to ask a question?
I just want to say that, like, I was reading that there's like 3 levels of tefillah that Hashem like genuinely listened to. And it was like the tefillah of Moshe Rabbeinu, where like he was able to understand like the inner wisdom and the depth of tefillah, and like every word and every letter and every vow, every single aspect of his tefillah was Hashem was like, he'd give ear to that. Then there's the tefillah of a king. A king would give you like, would give Hashem like pleads of prosperity and for his people, and Hashem would listen to that. But the prayer that Hashem listens to the most is the prayer of the poor people. Hashem pushes everything aside to listen to the poor people. And it's like that's what's saying here.
Yeah.
Is that like if you're suffering, if you're in pain, if you've got anguish, if you're like in a broken place, Hashem will like push everything aside.
What waters to lift you up?
Exactly.
You pray better. Okay.
There's someone gave me this was the beginning of their siddur. Like there's the water that lift you up, and so you see it as a positive thing. But there's like these waters could be like problems or distractions, and it's also like a metaphor of like if these distractions are all around you, they're the only thing that can allow you to be centered, because only relative to them can you find the center.
Get in the ark.
It's kind of like that's the teva that's
exactly
enabling you to have a powerful prayer, and you take refuge in that center.
This is why the waters of Noach are actually called by their name. They give a sort of a Naicha Derucha means a restful spirit, right? Shubachinas Hashabes, right? Why is it called? Noach is a translation, as we said before, the Aramaic of the word Shabbos. Kivo Shabbos Mikom Malachto. Why? Because what is Shabbos? Is basically, as we said earlier in a different class, that when a person is working in the 6 days of the week, the whole idea is you have to contract your sort of peaceful state of mind and bring them down into the work of your hands. So you're not able to take part in your most abstract ideas. You can't like think deeply when you're busy, troubled with, trying to fix the engine of your car, right? Like your abstract potential greatest thoughts, your philosophical, so to speak, mind has to contract itself into mundane things. So this is like the 6 days of the week. Shabbos, right, is called Naicha Derucha. It's called Noach because basically your spirit goes back up and it pulls itself out of all these contractions and it like re-establishes its connection with its purest ability to think. So that's what we're saying, like the elevation, right, of a person is when he pulls himself out, and that's what Shabbos is at the end of every week, right? That you can like return to yourself. And this is what he's saying, that the waters of Noach, that's what they do to you, right? They ultimately raise the boat up and bring you into a higher state, like a person who's resting from his work and returns to his highest mind. And that's what he says here. Shebavav Yimei HaMaisa, in the 6 days of creation, 6 work days, Hu b'chinas hispashtus v'hamshachas malchusu yizbarach lamata. Right? This is essentially Hashem extending his kingdom down, right? Like the king, he can't just sit there on his throne like appreciating his own majesty. He's busy running his kingdom. He's got to go tell this minister what to do and this minister what to do. He doesn't have like the peace and the pleasure of being the king when he's busy running his kingdom. So in the 6 days of the week, the Sphira of Malchus, right, which is basically when Hashem is called king, it has to descend into the realm of creation. And that's what we see on the first day. Hashem was busy making light, and the second day he was making the firmament. Then he was growing the grass. Right? All these things are like the actions, the activities of the king. It's not just the king in his splendor and majesty experiencing his own greatness. Those are called the days of deed. And in Shabbos, Hashem, so to speak, pulls back from his deeds. Right? He doesn't have to get busy fixing his engine, and therefore his soul sort of returns to himself, and he can once again experience the pleasure of his true glory. So you might say, well, wait a second, the world still exists on Shabbos. So isn't Hashem actually still kind of busy making the world on Shabbos? What actually happens on Shabbos that there's like this rest? You know what I'm saying? Right? It says that Sheshis Yamim Asa b'Shabbos v'Nafash. He made it on 6 days. Why does it say Asa? Because Asa is Lashon Asiya, which means he's going down into his work week, right? And then on Shabbos he rests. So he rests from his work. What was his work? His work was creating the world. So how is there even a world on Shabbos? That's one of the questions that's sometimes asked in Chassidut. If Hashem creates the world through speech, right? And he stops speaking on Shabbos, so how is there a world?
That's what makes Shabbos so holy.
What's that?
That's what makes Shabbos so holy. Actually, it's not.
No, but the question is, why is there still a world? If Hashem creates the world through his speech, he stops speaking on Shabbos. So, world. You're answering me with a...
But does God get
in a very peculiar way. I don't know what to say to you. How is there a world on Shabbos? What I'm trying to say.
Questions asked.
No questions asked.
But does God get
A
tired?
Polisher.
God get tired if he has to rest?
Tired is another question, but let's stay with one question at a time. How is there a world on Shabbos if what we're saying is Hashem has to like busy himself and to create, let there be light and a firmament, all these things on Shabbos? They're still there.
Do you think even Hashem really even has to busy himself, or
if he didn't
want to, he can still have a world without busying himself? He's a chef.
But he told us how he makes the world, and he makes the world by Sheshis Yamim Asa.
But he's not limited.
Which means he goes down and contracts himself.
But he's not limited by it.
To a certain degree, it's a self-limitation that he puts on himself. Otherwise, he wouldn't have told us that he does it like that.
But Shabbos.
Okay, that's not the answer.
Does that have anything to do with the fact that on Shabbos everything goes back like one level up, like one stage higher in its source?
Exactly. So what does it mean? So it says when Hashem rested from speech, he didn't rest from thought, right? And so everything kind of goes back up into its thought, and therefore the world is existing no longer in a state of speech. The whole world is existing as it is in a level up, in a state of thought. So the world that you see on Shabbos is actually a different world than you see during the weekday. It's not Hashem busying himself and going down. It's the return of all this energy. So what, the world's still existing? Yeah, because the world also exists up there in a higher dimension. Okay, and that's basically why we say that, it says that if you check the pulse of a Jew on Shabbos, it's different than on a weekday. And there's also statements to the effect that it says that even Amma Aretz cannot lie on Shabbos. There's actually a physical, recognizable difference. It's brought in Chassidus, these two examples as well as others, to point out that this is not some theoretical thing. Right, doctors like the Frierdiker Rebbe's doctor, it's brought in Chassidus that there's actually a recognizable, measurable difference of the physical state of the world, because the world is not what it is on the 6 days of the week. It's residing in a state of thought, and therefore it still exists, but it's elevated its whole experience. So, but that's what we call it, Naicha Derucha. Hashem is not busying himself to go so low. He allows his sort of higher dimension to come back to his senses, like a person who rests from their work. The world's still there. The world is existing in that state of like higher pleasure. That's why we call Shabbos Tainug and Oneg, because Hashem's pleasure has come back to himself, and therefore it floods everything in existence, including the world that we live in.
Well, it's like Yom Shikul or Shabbos.
Avram, you get that?
Yeah.
You listened to the answer? You got upset that you didn't have the answer.
No.
So when Yom Kippur Shabbos, like the whole existence of creation will be like Shabbos in the sense that it's no longer speech that's creating the world.
Yes.
It's thought, and everything's on a higher.
And
level.
even beyond thought, right? It goes up into like how the world is in the midos, and how the world is in the mochin, how the world is in the will. Like we said many times, the world has always been there. How do we explain the other day that Hashem, when He created the world, He's exactly the same before He created the world and after He created the world? Didn't something happen? So we're saying the world was always there. That's why nothing happened when He created. The only thing that happened is that He removed something. Now He didn't add something. What did He remove? He removed the infinite levels of light which previously were drowning the world. And so all of a sudden the world experienced itself without all that infinite light around it. And so it seemed like something took place, where really what took place was just a hiding of the infinite. When the world goes back up into its source, it will still be there like it is now. It's just that it will be a recipient of the infinite light, which it's even presently right now sitting inside of. It's just that it doesn't experience it because Hashem is hiding it. So that's what happens on every Shabbos. And that's why every Shabbos doesn't just go back to where it was. It goes higher and higher and higher, because every single Shabbos is after 6 whole days of the entire Jewish people doing Torah mitzvahs. So the world doesn't just go back to where it was the previous Shabbos. It goes higher and deeper and inner, and ultimately it returns to its essential level, drowned inside the Or Ein Sof, but it will still exist in our perception. It'll just exist in a state of total tainug, because that level of Hashem's essential tainug will fill it and permeate it.
Is it basically every time it's going up a level, it's now in a state where there's less vessels also?
Not less vessels, but better vessels. More refined vessels, like we were saying in the beginning of class.
Okay.
To the point that according to the Rebbe, we've already taken these vessels as high as they can go. That's why we suddenly have weird technology. You could literally hold the whole world in your pocket. And soon you'll probably be able to just sort of do things that we can't even imagine, because the materialism of the world has been so beaten and worked from the flood, from the Holocaust, all these things that basically just destroy the world and bring it to its coarseness and take off the husks, which is called the klippas. It means the world itself is now a kli to handle something infinite. Just like before, you would never imagine that the entire Library of Congress, which takes up many city blocks, you could have in your pocket. If you said that to someone, you'd be in some weird Hasidus class where you were describing some futuristic state of reality, and we're in that state of reality right now, right? Materialism has changed. They used to say, how many angels can you fit on the head of a pin? How much information can you put in a microchip? You know what I'm saying? Do they even have microchips anymore? I don't know.
I saw a video how many kind of papers or files stacking up, how high 1 terabyte microchip would make it.
Right, to the moon, right? Yeah. Okay, so moving on. So this is the idea
Until
of
you get to the cloud, which is literally none, which is the infinite tree, which has the infinite. Wow.
And we've been given these technological examples in order to even further have our mind understand what's going on in the cosmos. Right. So he says this is like a person who rests from his work, right? But these waters are called the Noach, which means Shabbos, which means someone who sort of comes back to his senses, raises up into a higher dimension. Naicha derucha shu aliyas ha'olamos. That's what's called the elevation of the worlds. Where do the worlds go? Do we go up? The elevation of the worlds means that instead of experiencing ourselves as a speech of Hashem, we now experience ourselves as a thought of Hashem, which is inside of the mind of Hashem as opposed to outside the mouth of Hashem. That's what it means, an elevation of the worlds. The worlds are already as elevated as they could possibly be. They're inside and one with the Ein Sof. It's just that we experience ourselves at different levels of separation. When this Noach happens, this elevation, this raising up, it's the idea that the world now experiences itself closer and closer to inside of its true source. Ka'adam hashovis v'noach malachto. Just like a person who rests from his work, that suddenly levels of pleasure and endorphins and everything just sort of starts to come out because he's back to his sentence. He's not contracting himself and lowering his mental capacity into building this chair, right? So this sort of replenishing of his inner powers, that's what happens to the whole world. That's what it means. It elevates. And that's the idea of the water being elevated due to the Mayim Rabim. This is what the problems of a parnasa will do to a person. in physical matters, in Yanim Gashmi, Shenikra Mayim Rabim, which are called the mighty waters. When you will transform them and then they elevate afterwards into godliness through davening, through going into the ark, right? Which is what reveals the advantageous nature of these waters. If you build an ark, you see that these are not destructive waters. These are beneficial waters. Nikra Therefore, this whole level, the ark, Noah's ark, the waters themselves become the waters of Noah. They're really waters of peace, waters of Shabbos, which elevate you. Shabbos canal. And that's what we were saying earlier, that there's basically there's a little Shabbos in every day, and that's called tefillah. Right? So just like on Shabbos in general, you come out of the whole work-a-day week and you elevate and have this rush of pleasure of being able to go back to your senses, not be bothered. You also have that every day, primarily in Shacharis, but also in all three tefillahs, that the davening itself is called Shabbos. That's why Teva means Tevos HaTefillah, because every single day you can jump into that ark. It doesn't have to be Shabbos. You can find that elevation in each and every davening.
So like in every mundane thing that we do, we're actually refining the vessel so that our tefillah could be higher.
Yeah, every Monday new, when you climb into the ark, all that took place in your life, which now is the cause of your deepening your prayers, it all became the cause of your elevation to find this newfound place of peace.
But you can make it the reason as well.
He's kind of trying to get a word in there.
Does that mean that our tefillah interfaces with Hashem at the same spiritual level that Shabbos it comes from, like the holding existence of Shabbos? Like our tefillah doesn't go through to like the
depends. It depends who you are.
Really?
It depends who you are. Not everybody's tefillah reaches there because you have to actually get into a state of Shabbos. Right? There's a famous story about the students of the Maggid, that they used to have this unbelievably elevated experience with the Maggid on Shabbos. And they were wondering, is it really like Shabbos that's doing this, or is it just like our efforts? Because we get together in our Straimalach, and we've got the Chol, and the Rebbe's giving Torah, and we just have the Shabbos. We make the Shabbos. The Shabbos doesn't make the Shabbos. So they wanted to test the theory. So they all got together, and the head mashpia started from bringing, and they had the whole Shabbos, and they all were looking around. They're like, it's Mama's Shabbos right now. And so they went back to the Maggid. They were all upset. They're like, Shabbos is could be any time. And he's like, the truth is Shabbos is all the time. It's because what are we saying? It's this underlying dimension of the world in its source. Well, the world's always in its source. It's just that Hashem is hiding that from us during the 6 days of the week. If you go find it, you can find it on Monday. That's what they say. They quote some people say that the first source of this is from the YTD website. I don't know exactly where this is printed, but we used to have it on our website that Shvas on a weekday is like Shabbos for the rest of the world. You've heard that before? Apparently, when the Frierdiker Rebbe came here, he said that the whole city of Shvas is living in Shabbos even during the week, which means Shabbos here is even something greater. But the point is that, and someone made a joke because nobody works here. But the point is that it's true. There's when you come into this place, what do people say? They're like, I don't know what it is about this place. I just feel spiritual, right? Because there's even the mundane. At the end of the day, nothing is truly mundane. It's just that the spirit, the infinite spiritual light is hiding from it more or less. So the students of the Maggid, they dug so deeply inside of the mundane, they found the underlying source of the world right there. And you could do it every day in davening, if you can do it every day in davening.
Why?
I once asked Rabbi Ginsburg, in my younger days, I was a jazz musician, and I caught him in his way to a lecture. I said, Rabbi, can I elevate jazz? And he said, I don't know, can you? Right? Can you find Shabbos in the middle of the week? You could, but can you? It's not so simple, right? But it's possible, because it's possible to find it anytime, even when you're not davening, in theory.
Why is it that during Shabbos you're not then supposed to pray for things that you need and want? You're supposed to daven for the sanctity of Shabbos and how it's the day of rest and it's a holy day and Hashem made it, the entire creation for this day. If we're supposed to be, if we can elevate everything up to Shabbos, then
right?
Why is
I said if you can.
But
right?
But if you can't,
But you can't. In other words, it's like that the students of the Magid, right, could, and I'm sure they're in their prayers on the weekday, they probably didn't find themselves to be davening like, I need this and I need this and I need this, like a person normally who's like a regular human being would. They were anyway outside of their own sense of self, so they probably found the same pleasure in and sort of like lack of penitent, even in a weekday. But for the rest of us, where Hashem is putting on the tzimtzumim, and He is intentionally creating a world where we feel to ourselves to be separate. Therefore, the normal, natural reality is for us to say, "Okay, we're in this separate place. Help us out." Whereas on Shabbos, Hashem's taking away seemingly all the tzimtzumim. The world is already not in a state of feeling separate. Therefore, to go and say at that time, "Help us out," there's no you to help out. You're just like misaligned. So the words of prayers mirror that. Right now, if you're going to find Shabbos mamish on a weekday, you probably would have a completely different, like Hasidic perush on all those penitent prayers that they don't mean that anymore, right? But for the rest, for the Torah al Rav Tedaber, it says the Torah speaks to the majority. So the prayers reflect what the majority are experiencing, which is a sense of self and a need to get out of this place. Ach kol zehu Shabbos tata. This is exactly what we were just describing. All this is called the lower Shabbos, right? V'yesh od b'chinas Shabbos ilah. There is a higher Shabbos. Shuma sheyeh la'asi. It's what will be in the future. Shenikra yom shekulu Shabbos. It's called the day which is all Shabbos, right? So even Shabbos that we have now, the seventh day, into a certain degree, it's still not like a real perfect Shabbos of perfect pleasure and so forth. Because on a certain level, you're also going to go back to the work. So there's still not a complete elevation, right? So I'm saying now the opposite. Not only can you find the ultimate Shabbos even on a weekday prayer, in theory, you can't even find the ultimate Shabbos on a Shabbos prayer because there's different levels of Shabbos. And in the future, when all the days will be Shabbos, this is called the higher level of Noach. These waters of distraction are not there to, so to speak, raise up the boat because we need to get out of this world and run from the opponent of these waters. And they give us like like we've been saying this whole time, they give us like an extra oomph to get out, like the businessman who needs to go higher than the right? So that's level one of Shabbos, the lower level. The higher level of Shabbos, they're not there to spur on an elevation, to get away from distraction. Right? They're a complete transformation. There will no longer be weekday. And that's why it says Hashem at one point swears He won't bring the floodwaters again to the earth. In other words, the distractions of the physicality, that whole chapter will be over. We won't experience the floodwaters as a distraction or something like this. There will be no more floodwaters to drown us. Because even though these floodwaters ultimately are coming to purify, we said there's 40 days, like the 40 seah of a mikvah. The world will not always need such an unbelievable level of purity, right? You purify, why? Because you try to turn that big, strong cedar tree into a reed. So you got to break it and flip it around and basically test it against all the opposition. But once we refine the kli, which apparently we're in this time now, the Rebbe declared in 1990 that we've refined all the sparks. So therefore, we won't have another Holocaust. We won't need any more like bothers of the world. That's why the Rebbe also sort of changed our way of thinking. Like, it's good to be a Jew. People say schwer zu sein a Yid. It's hard to be a Jew, and the Rebbe said, like, stop saying that. We're taking that out of the Jewish vocabulary. It's great to be a Jew. We don't need the refinement of the flood wars anymore. We had enough tsaris to refine us, and we raised up all the way. Now we're in a state where Hashem swears He's not going to bring the flood waters anymore. Because He swore, due to His anger against us, right? That's why the flood waters came. But now He won't need them anymore. Because even though we said above that through the Mayim Rabim you wind up with an advantageous light, you suddenly feel this miodecha going out of your boundaries. You can't stand it anymore, and you find this intensity within inside yourself. There's another higher level of great love. Which is even higher than the love that comes from these flood waters. And that's basically the realization that the physicality itself is your friend. It's not something that you have to fight against, right? So the weekday, for example, is no longer something you need to run into your boat to avoid, and therefore the weekday will lift up your Shabbos. That's only when you still require refining and like you have to like break up your yeshus. But ultimately, the weekday will be Shabbos as well, which means the very opponent will become your friend, and you won't have to have these distractions and take the advantage from the distractions. You'll realize the Gashmias itself, which has now become refined through all these different elevations, Shabbos after Shabbos after Shabbos after Shabbos, you got to the point where the Gashmias is refined, and therefore it will elicit something even greater than its koach of opposition. That's the idea that his right hand grasped me, right? Like he's gonna just like sort of hold you. And this is a futuristic love, as it says, Ki aharim yamushu v'agvaos timutena v'chasdim itcha lo yamushu bri shlomi lo tamut. So it says the mountains will crumble and the hills will fall, but my kindness will never falter and my bris of peace will never falter. Which means, what are the mountains and the hills? This is the idea of these aliyahs, where you have to keep going higher, and you go down, and you go higher, and you're trying to get higher and higher and higher. The whole idea of the regular Shabbos, which is the Mayim Rabim, which is to lift up your words of prayer, that's the idea that you want to go up. The worlds are created in speech, you want them to be created in thought. The worlds are created in thought, you want them to be a higher state of emotion and intellect. You want to go higher. If you're still going higher, and that's your goal, then ultimately you're still living in a constricted level of understanding. Because if you're going higher, that means you've prescribed to the concept of high and low, right? And if you're prescribing to the concept of high and low, that means you're still dealing with a kav, right? A little sliver to some degree. You just want to be higher in the kav, right? You want to gain ground. Ultimately, the mountains will disappear. The idea of like climbing higher and higher will disappear because the essential light will come out, which means that it's a circle. It's not a line. And a circle, there's no beginning and there's no end. There's no high and there's no low. Every single thing is permeated with the essence of God. It doesn't matter if you're a simpleton or a scholar or a plant or a tree or a human being. Basically, the essence of Hashem it comes out and it negates the notion of relative superiority. So we're not going to be trying to raise the ark higher and higher. We're going to just like tap into the essence of Gashmias, which, as we said in the earlier parts of the Maimer, that the essence of Gashmias is really the essence of Hashem, and therefore weekday and Shabbos will be alike. So Yom Shekulo Shabbos. And that's called Chesed Elyon V'Ava Rabba Haba Melamayla. This is this like higher chesed and this greater love which will come from above, so that Hashem, so to speak, his right hand will be grabbing you. V'gava me'od shebechinas b'chol miyodecha yim bechinas gavoa yoser. And then it says v'gava me'od in the pasuk, where it says the waters gava me'od, which means they went up over me'od, which means there's a level which is called beyond b'chol miyodecha. Even that state where you have like pulling yourself and finding your innermost strength, which we were praising before, called the level of b'chol miyodecha. There's a hint into the waters that gava mi'od, which means you're going to go above the level of b'chol mi'odecha, because even b'chol mi'odecha, even though you're going out of your limitations, you're reaching something unlimited, there's still a you there, right? There's still a feeling of me having to get out of something, and my sense of self is still preserved, which means I have to elevate it, albeit I'm elevating it with a much greater vigor, due to the fact that I have the Mayim Rabim to help me, but it's still not out of the cycle, so to speak, of relative elevations. And therefore, Gava Mi'od, which means this level which is hinted to in the parsha, is talking about the messianic end of the Mabul, which is the essence being revealed and the ultimate Ava Rabbah. End. Okay, you had a question?
Yeah, it was just in the dead